Welcome to the NAGC webinar, our Gifted 101, the 5 things you need to know. As everyone is coming in, I invite you to tell us a little bit about yourselves in the chat. You can tell us where you are, what students you serve. You could even tell us a little bit about the weather or your district. So we'd love to learn a little bit more about you and who all is here. We're just gonna hold for a moment or two while folks start coming in. I'm really excited that you're joining today or watching this recorded later. I appreciate your dedication to your craft and your students. Spending this time to learn a bit more about serving high ability students. And it's great to have such a range of educators and specialists who are serving students in a lot of different capacities. That's wonderful. One of the things that I have found over my career is that I have learned a lot from my colleagues, both colleagues in my building and in my district and colleagues in other places. I think it's really valuable to get to know other people who are really passionate about gifted and high ability learners and build on their shoulders and get ideas. So it's wonderful. So as people are telling about themselves, kind of scroll through and see who you might build a connection with. All right. So I am Lynette Breedlove. I work as the director of the Gatton Academy of Mathematics and Science, which is a residential program for high ability or gifted and talented students on the campus of Western Kentucky. So this is a residential program where high school students come to finish their last 2 years of high school by basically starting college. It is an amazing place for gifted and high ability students because our students can take advantage of all of the benefits of a college campus. So there's really no lid on their academics. At the same time, they're in a dedicated community in our residence hall with dedicated staff who support their social emotional needs. So they get the best of both worlds, and they're in a community of peers. Before coming to lead the Gatton Academy in Bowling Green, Kentucky, I was a central office administrator overseeing gifted and talented advanced studies kind of programming in the Houston area and several different districts. So all of my career in education has been in public school settings, because even here where I am now, the state supports the program and our students receive full scholarships for tuition, housing, and meals. So it is considered a public program. Unfortunately, there are only about 5 programs like this in the US. There are some state-supported residential schools that are like public boarding schools, and most of these programs are in the South. But if you are ever interested in learning more about this kind of a program, just reach out to me. I'd be happy to connect you more with that. So with that, let's talk about the 5 things you need to know. It also is important if you are new to gifted ed to not get overwhelmed. Pick 1 or 2 things that you really want to dig into, get good at those things, and then move on to the next. When I was first starting in gifted ed, I tended to get overwhelmed when I went to professional learning opportunities and thinking all of the things I was not doing for my students. And that wasn't very productive. When I switched to focusing on 1 or 2 things that I wanted to get better at, then I was able to really make progress. And I had to just be kind to myself and know that it takes time to get better at something. You just have to practice it. And you can't get better of everything at the same time. So, all right. So hopefully while you're watching today and participating today, you will resonate with some things that you already knew or you're already doing, and you can pick 1 or 2 things that might add to your toolbox. All right, so the 5 things. Narrowing it down to 5 things was really hard. Gifted, talented, and high ability learners are a very diverse population. So that's number one. And you'll notice I'm going to use gifted and talented and high ability learners quite interchangeably. It depends on the state where you are, how this group of students are labeled. Okay. So I'm kind of talking about the same group of students with really high potential who are a little different than others and need some special services because they're outliers in their abilities. All right. So number two, gifted and talented and high ability learners tend to have asynchronous development. They also tend to be intense. Flexibly grouping them can facilitate learning, and they need targeted differentiation. So we're going to lean into these 5 things. So we're going to start with gifted and talented and high ability learners are a diverse population. So I want you to take a moment and think. When you think of a stereotypical gifted and talented student, how would you describe them? What are you picturing in your head? That stereotype of that high ability learner. I am betting that is someone who is rather studious. Maybe they wear glasses. You might even describe them as nerdy, right? They have some deep knowledge in something, right? Maybe you're picturing a student like this because we also usually tend to picture younger students. And we associate being gifted and talented or having high potential with being a child, with school. Although even after school, people still have high potential and they still have abilities that might be outliers from the general population. So we also tend to stereotype high ability and gifted and talented students as white or Asian. But gifted and talented students come from every population and they are very diverse. The diversity within the population of gifted and high ability learners is just as broad as in any other population. I think that I'm starting talking about this because we're going to talk about them as a singular group, even though students within that group have a wide array of needs and a wide array of characteristics. So there isn't really one just stereotype that we should lean into, and we should be careful and avoid that. Because gifted and talented high ability education kind of has a history of focusing on the stereotype, and we have been working to move away from that for a long time, but we aren't there yet. So let's look at the definition from NAGC, right? So with NAGC, there are a few things that really pop out of this definition. You can be gifted in one or more domain. Gifted and talented high ability learners come from every population and economic strata. You can also be twice exceptional. You can have learning and processing disorders and have high ability. So even the core definition highlights the diversity of this population. The Javits Act definition, so this is our federal definition. It's kind of old, comes from 1988. But even then, it focused on different areas of giftedness. So sometimes when we think of a stereotype of gifted, we mostly think of school-based and academics. So really good at reading or a math prodigy. Sometimes we also think about the arts, right? So that music prodigy or the young artist. But it can also be in leadership and in creativity. And you note in the Javits Act that creativity and arts are listed separately. Creativity doesn't necessarily mean that you are gifted in the arts. It means you can think of many different possibilities, that the way you think about the world puts things together, current things together in new ways, right? So entrepreneurs and innovation, that really highlights creativity, which is a wonderful thing that we're starting to talk about and highlight in schools today. So that's been a really positive thing that's come out of tech ed, is broadening how we serve people who are creatively gifted, right? So thinking about giftedness isn't as narrow as we tend to think about it. And then twice exceptional. And twice exceptional is the term that we use to describe students who are gifted and have another exceptionality. And students might actually have multiple exceptionalities, not just be twice exceptional, one thing and one thing, right? But the twice exceptional is the accepted term. And again, twice exceptional students are found in every economic and cultural background. So these are students who have ADHD and they're gifted. They're on the autism spectrum and gifted, or they have a learning disability and they're gifted, or they might have a physical disability and be gifted. Just the broad range. And we tend not to find these students until they get a little bit older because the two things tend to like cancel each other out. So the disability tends to hide the giftedness, and the giftedness allows them to cope with the disability longer. So it's usually in upper elementary and middle school that we tend to find students, particularly students who are intellectually gifted and have a learning disability. So kids in this population, this gifted and talented high ability learners, are diverse economically, they're diverse culturally, they're diverse by domain, their area of strength. They're also varied in their level of giftedness. If we think about this cognitively, that's kind of where this chart comes from, like where your IQ is. IQ is not the only part of being cognitively gifted. That's an important thing to understand. It is a piece of it. And there are people who have really exceptional IQs, and they are so different than their same age peers cognitively. It can be very difficult to serve exceptionally and profoundly gifted students in a traditional school setting. If we think about this in the terms of athletics, right? So sports tend to be a really good analogy for us because that is a high ability that our culture values and that you can see, right? And we have very extensive athletic programs. We do talent development in athletics very well. If we applied that in every area of every domain and every ability area, we would have great talent development across the board. So if you think about the array of physical abilities, there are students who are varsity high school athletes that we would consider playing at a very high level, but not all of them have the skills, abilities, and the whole package to be able to play Division I sports, right? And then of the students who play Division I sports, not all of them have the extreme abilities and all the other pieces you need to go to a farm team. And then from the farm teams, then you go to pro teams, right? So there are different levels, and we see that, we expect that. We talk that to all of our students who want to be, professional athletes, that the chance of being a professional athlete is very rare because you have to have all of the specific ingredients and the exceptional ability. So we can think about that array of ability in every endeavor. And that helps us understand that gifted and talented and high ability students need an array of services. So you can't just offer one program or one class or one approach that's going to meet the needs of every gifted and talented and high ability learner because they're all different. The level of giftedness is different, their area of giftedness is different, their background that they bring to things is different. And all of those things mean that our services need to be complex in meeting their needs. So that is likely why some things that you have been trying to serve gifted students works with some, but not with others. Because just like in your classroom, one size doesn't fit all in all your strategies, same thing in gifted and talented programming. So we need to provide an array of services for the array of students that we have. Okay, thing you need to know, number 2, gifted and talented and high ability learners tend to develop asynchronously. So asynchronous development, what does that really mean? Well, there are a lot of different aspects to asynchrony. First, within themselves, their level of development is different physically, cognitively, socially, and emotionally. So when we think about child development, we have developmental milestones that we expect of people of different ages, right? So you kind of know what a 5-year-old can do and how they interact with the world, how they think about things, socially, what they can handle, right? Their physical development. And we know that for every age. And everyone's not at the same place at the same time, but you kind of have, you know, bandwidth expectations for them, right? Well, high ability people are outliers in this. They have an area within themselves that has developed at a faster rate. Something they do in their performance or their potential performance is an outlier. So if I'm looking for cognitively gifted students and I'm doing testing, I am looking for students whose test score is going to show that their cognitive development is far more advanced than their same age peers. Whether that's in reading or math or whatever, that's what I'm going to look for. And they're going to have this spike in the C, in that cognitive area. And they maybe have the same development as every other student in their peer group, their age peer group. Physically or socially, they might be more or less developed in other areas. I do caution you because the stereotype is that gifted and talented students are socially less developed than others. But that's a myth. What we're looking at is actually the asynchrony between their cognitive abilities or their physical or interpersonal abilities and their social abilities. We expect if you can talk like an adult, you will act like an adult and be an adult. Because however you talk and communicate is how we decide your level of thinking, your maturity, and all of that. And just because you can talk or think through a problem like an adult doesn't mean you have the life experience or the emotional maturity or the social skills of an adult. But that disparity between how you can think and talk and how you act or interact with people creates a gap. It's asynchronous. And so we tend to say, oh, that gifted student has no practical sense. Well, no, because they don't have any life experience yet. Or, you know, they don't interact with people who are like them very much. They're using their social skills all the time. So it's important to kind of think about this asynchrony as we think about how we understand the students in our rooms. The other thing that's tricky about this is that schools are designed for people who are pretty much synchronous, you know, that they fit with the main group. And that means that the way we do all of our classrooms and lunch and every different system in school is built around synchronous development, which doesn't fit kids who are asynchronous. They might need more advanced things in reading and, you know, less advanced things in PE or, you know, socially. They might get along well with older kids, but not their same age group of kids. So thinking about how we group kids and move them around the school is impacted by this asynchrony. And every gifted student has a different pattern. There isn't one pattern. So in this case, this would be a physically gifted student. So this is a gifted athlete or a gifted dancer, or maybe a gifted musician because you need that physical ability to be able to play most instruments, right? So they have this asynchronous development too. It's just their pattern is a little bit different. And as I mentioned, it's really important not to treat high ability and gifted and talented students like they're adults. They're not. They might be able to argue and win the debate, but they're still a kid and they haven't had the life experience to go with how they can think about things. And that's part of their asynchrony. So they're out of sync with each other, with other people, right? Because their developmental pattern is different. They're asynchronous within themselves because, man, I can think of amazing things, but I can't make my hand do it because I don't have that physical development yet. And they're asynchronous across domain. There are students who are incredibly gifted in math and not in anything else, or incredibly gifted in reading and not in anything else. And that can be hard because the student might say, well, gosh, how come I'm really great at reading, but I cannot do math? And their expectations are that if I can do this thing in school well, I should be able to do all things in school well. And those expectations on themselves, as well as other people's expectations of them, can make that tricky. Another piece of this asynchrony that's interesting and important for us to think about is that different areas of talent have different trajectories of development. So coming back to our athletics, thinking about gymnasts, their advanced abilities start in childhood, and the development of those peak and end in adolescence, right? I mean, think about all of our athletes and how unusual it is for a gymnast to be in their 20s, right? So that pattern kind of peaks, develops really fast, peaks early, kind of ends early. Track and field is different. Track and field starts later and develops over time and then ends in adulthood. Math, you start seeing it in childhood and it could peak in adolescence or in adulthood. Psychology is a much later field. Singing, right? The development of the voice. There are childlike boy sopranos, but that changes in adolescence. And so long term, being able to vocal perform tends to develop after puberty and peaks then in adulthood. Violin, same thing. So the point of all this is that depending on the domain of talent, what students need when differs, and when you're going to see potential and development changes. And so as educators, we have to think about where is this child's strengths and where are they on that developmental path and when can I make the most difference? Like wherever they are in this path with me now, where can I help them grow at this point in time? So this asynchrony leads to their needing an array of services because gifted in math needs something different than gifted in reading. And students who have abilities that are closer to their same age peers need one kind of services, and students who have more extreme giftedness need different kinds of services. And so we need to continue to think about an array and meeting students' needs based on where they are, both in their personal development, in their degree of giftedness, and their domain of talent. So we've gone over a couple of really key pieces, so, and that both lead to their need for an array of services. I'm gonna wonder if you have questions about this. We can pause here for just a moment and see. Lots of great discussion. I should have made it a little more clear that the P was for physical, C was for cognitive, S was for social, and E was emotional in that chart. I should have slowed down there just a little bit. All right, we're going to keep going, and you are welcome to add questions to the chat because we will do some questions at the end as well. All right, so we are moving on to thing number 3. And that is gifted and talented and high ability learners tend to be intense. I think about it is that the parts of the brain that allow the student to have that advanced ability creates that same kind of intensity in other areas of their life, right? So high ability and gifted students tend to be really focused in their area of expertise, in their area of giftedness. They tend to be very curious and persistent in their chosen area, right? Or the area that really connects with them. They can also be very opinionated, right? They know a lot. They know the answer. Their answer is right. Others are wrong. That's something, wrestling with that gray is something that they tend to work on over time. And then emotionally, they also tend to be intense emotionally. Just in the same way, they're curious and opinionated, and some of that leads to perfectionism. Now, the research doesn't necessarily indicate that gifted and talented and high ability students are more often perfectionists than others. I think we notice it because of their high level abilities I think having high level abilities tends to lend to expectations that you will do well and other people's expectations that you will perform beyond others. So we're going to look at perfectionism for a bit. Different psychologists would tell you that perfectionism is good or bad. So Tom Greenspan, Brene Brown, they say that perfectionism is bad because perfectionism in their definition is about getting acceptance or self-worth from others by being perfect. Like that you believe for others to value you, you have to perform or do things perfectly. And that focus on others is unhealthy. Other researchers have defined healthy and unhealthy perfectionism. And the terms they use are adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism. So in adaptive perfectionism, you have high personal standards and you strive to continue to do well in pursuit of that high standard. In maladaptive, those standards are very exacting. They are for sometimes yourself and for others. And when you don't meet this standard, that comes with a lot of self-deprecation and a lot of negativity and a lot of negative emotion, right? And it comes from fears of your parents being disappointed or upsetting your teacher. You see it in excessive concerns over mistakes, and then lots of doubts about action. I don't know if I can do this. I don't think can do this. I'm not sure I did that right. I'm sure I did that wrong. And so all of that can be really complex and unhealthy. So I think in what is helpful for us to think about in schools, I think helping students see the differences between adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism can be beneficial. And there are some psychology tests or some tools to use to measure different components of perfectionism that can help professionals and students kind of figure out where they are on that scale, right? On which things are healthy components and allow me to be better and which things are unhealthy and hurt me in the long run. So unhealthy perfectionism tends to look like compulsion, right? Attention to detail and inability to move on. So a lot of times students who are not turning their work, who are high ability students, they're not turning it in because it's not finished yet. It's not good enough yet. There are students who do their work and hide it in their backpack and never turn it in, not just because they're disorganized, but because they can't bring themselves to turn in something they don't feel is perfect. Also leads to overcommitting, saying yes to a lot of things because that's part of people's expectation and of my being perfect. I can do all of the things perfectly. And that's how I get value, which is not healthy. And having exceptionally high standards can really hurt relationships, both for yourself and if you put those exceptional standards on other people. And then procrastination. It's interesting, but procrastination goes hand in hand with perfectionism. Procrastinating is the perfect out, right? Students tell themselves, I work better under pressure. I just had this conversation with a student this morning. Oh no, I don't need to work on it now. I seem to really do my best writing, the hour before it's due. No, that isn't your best writing. It might be your most stressed writing, but it's probably not your best writing. I just need to think about it a little bit longer and then I'll be ready. No, you're thinking about it. And generally procrastination is, I am not sure I can do a perfect job. And I am worried about how people will perceive it or that I won't do a good job. And so I'm just not going to think about it. I'm not going to work on it right now. So then you push that off. And then when it comes back up, well, gosh, now I don't have as much time, but I'm not sure I can do it very well. So I'm going to keep pushing it off and pushing it off. And then it's the last minute. Well, nobody can do a good job at the last minute. I mean, I had 8 things that I had to turn in at one time. So if those 8 things weren't perfect, it's probably okay because I did 8 things at one time. It like gives yourself an out of not being perfect. And then you excuse it by, I needed more time. I work better under pressure. Like none of that's true. It's just self-talk and it's avoidance of the thing that you aren't confident that you can do, right? So we have to help our students take action. So focusing on the effort, not the grade or the outcome. A lot of the work we've been doing in schools around mindset is really helping students know with practice and effort, everyone gets better. And not being perfect or failing is a big part of getting better. With social media now, students tend to see the end product. So my son, when he was younger, loved Dude Perfect, and they do crazy adventure things, or they will shoot a basket from the 3 rows up in the arena and make it. Well, they don't always show you the 150 tries it took to make that possible. You only see the final outcome of that. And now everybody's making videos like that on social media. You only see the end product, not all the work to get and not all the failure to get to the end product. So it's important that we help our students understand that failure is a normal part of this process. We need to applaud that learning from mistakes, which is very mindset based. Something you can do is learn something new together. So really highlighting, I don't know how to do this already. I'm learning, which means I'm going to make mistakes. Let's make mistakes together as we figure this out. And you, as an educator, have to be willing to fail in front of your students. Maybe you're trying a lesson for the first time and it doesn't work the way you wanted it to. I have had that experience on many occasions. But I don't usually say to the students, okay, I've never taught this before. We're going to try this and see how it goes. Because that's pretty darn vulnerable. But it would help students know that, okay, you did it the first time. And then after you do it the first time, you say, okay, how did that go? What do you think I should change differently when I do this again next year? And get their feedback so that they see that you are growing, that you do things that are not perfect or right or meet your standards the first time. And that can be really healthy for everybody. It's really important we avoid communicating that we expect perfect, right? So we don't say this should be easy for you. We don't say, I'm surprised you didn't understand that. When we pre-assess, which we're going to talk about in a moment, we don't expect them to have 100%. We give room for mistakes because everyone makes mistakes. And identifying what's good enough is really important. In our lives, we do not do everything to the best of our abilities. I do not clean my house to the best of my ability every time I clean house. Although I like it when it's really clean, but I don't always spend all the time to do that. I clean it to the best of my ability when I'm going to have guests, right? Because the need is different. Our students are in college. When you were in college, you probably were not able to focus totally and do your absolute best in every subject area on every assignment every time. You kind of learn to, I'm not doing so well in this class. This class is harder for me. I need to spend more time and effort. Or gosh, this test is coming up sooner and I need to spend time on this test, so I can't put as much time in this assignment. And you do that in your life today. Kids don't know that that's how life works. And so we need to help them start to understand. Sometimes you just need to get it done. Sometimes you need to do the absolute best job you can. And helping them know how to spend their energy and time can be beneficial. For your serious procrastinators, it's important to help them recognize their avoidance mechanisms. So what do you do instead of the thing that you're worried about? Maybe you clean your room or your desk. Maybe you suddenly need to tutor or help a friend, right? So what are the things that you do instead of the thing that you don't want to do? And then check your expectations. What are you saying to yourself about the end product that might not be real and might not be realistic? Also, breaking things down into smaller projects is really important. The hardest thing for a procrastinator to do is get started. Once you start, That begins the process of doing the work. So start the project, and then you're more likely to take the next step and the next step. And so breaking something down into, you don't have to think about the whole project. You have to think about one piece. What is the first piece? Just do the first piece. Then we'll think about the second piece. Having an accountability buddy can be beneficial too. Having an accountability buddy is someone who you will say, okay, I need to do this thing. And they will ask you, have you done this thing? And they will ask you to help them be accountable on something else too. Maybe there's a project they're going to do together. Maybe it's an activity you're going to go together, right? That's why, when we're working on our health and one of our goals is to exercise more, joining a class or having a partner work with you on it. So we're going to walk together 3 times a week. Having that partner helps you be accountable to someone outside of yourself, and it makes you more likely to take that step. So let's do that in the classroom with some assignments or breaking down a project. And then reward yourself when you achieve small goals. When you take that small step, then you reward yourself. So maybe it's a few minutes of Block Blast, or a few minutes of YouTube, or a few minutes of TikTok, or whatever it is. Maybe it's a walk, maybe it's, time with a friend, but rewarding yourself as you're achieving those goals is beneficial, and it will get you on the road. So gifted and high ability learners tend to be intense, which means you may need to teach them some coping strategies, some strategies to help take the next step, some strategies to manage their emotions or manage the intensity or manage their focus. When I think about focus, I had a second grade high ability learner who had the hardest time changing subjects. He was in a self-contained classroom, and once it was time to go from reading to math, he wasn't finished. And he really pushed back on, nope, it's time to do math now. And the teacher wanted to help him prepare for 3rd grade when, things were much more scheduled. And she felt like he needed to learn to make that transition right away. But he couldn't get there right away. He needed some time to transition. So we had to work on some strategies on, all right, here's a warning, here's how you're wrapping up, here's the next thing, and really giving him the time and the space to figure out how to transition. It got much better over the next few years, both with coaching and maturity. And he figured out when he could invest and when he couldn't. And that helped him with that focused transition. I think we see that kind of every day in our lives. When people around us are really intense and focused on something, they get all in, right? And helping people come out of that all in can be tricky, but it's just a part of helping people learn to cope with being really intense about things. All right. Item number 4. Flexibly grouping students can really help facilitate their learning. So this is about putting students together who are in the same place learning-wise to maximize your time and theirs. So I'm going to ask you to think back to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Okay? All right. So this little red circle is what I can do alone. That yellow is my zone of proximal development. It is what I can do when I have help. That help might be a YouTube video, right? It might be a teacher giving me instruction. It might be a repair person walking me through how to do the thing that I don't know how to do. It could be a self-help book, right? It's just anything outside of me allows me to do something I can't do alone. And once I do that once or twice, that becomes what I can do alone, right? And my zone of proximal development moves out. So now I can do all those things in that orange area by myself, and my zone moves out. So whether that's how to do calculus, right, or a certain kind of calculus, I can do this, but I need the teacher's help to do the things that are in that yellow area. After I have the help and I have some practice, that becomes what I can do. All right, so everything in our learning follows this kind of pattern. What I can do alone, my zone of when I get help, the stuff in that zone that we do is called scaffolding, right? And then my zone moves out. So in your class, students' zones are constantly moving. The other thing is that they're in different places when they start in your room. So high ability learners tend to have zones that move faster than others in their areas of giftedness. And when they come to you, they're already more advanced because the zone already moved faster before they came to you. So we group students so that their zone of proximal development are similar based on whatever it is you're teaching. And that's why grouping is really important. So grouping matches students' readiness with your instruction. Because if you're not operating in the student zone, you're not going to help them learn. It's either something they can already do or you're too far out of their zone and they're not going to get it. They're not going to understand. So we group students so that we're in their zone. A lot of schools, particularly elementary, do reading groups based on assessment. And you group students based on their comprehension and reading skills, right? And they move groups based on how they're developing. Well, that's flexible grouping. Flexible grouping is not about a student being in a group all the time, not the same group all the time. It is about match at this time in this content area. So you're constantly reassessing, which leads to moving groups. So that's different than only being in one group all the time, right? So I could be in an advanced math group for some units and not others, and I could be in traditional reading, or I can be in advanced reading groups at sometimes and not others, and also be in advanced math. Each subject area is independent and you do it by unit. And it also facilitates students challenging one another and connecting with one another. When students are grouped so that they're in the same zone of proximal development, they can learn together. But that doesn't work when they're not in the same zone. When they're not in the same zone, that kind of leads to your high ability learners like doing the work for other people. They don't like that. The other students don't like that. Doesn't work very well. And this flexible grouping is very well researched. And it is important because it facilitates the growth of high ability students and it makes your job easier. When you have groups of students who are kind of in the same zones, you can target what you give them and it will help each group of students grow. I don't think about this as every individual student. Think of them as groups. So you might have 3 groups of students who are, in that same zone and then focusing on that group. And by doing that, everyone has a chance to grow. When you're grouping, it's really important to be deliberate about why you're doing that. So why are you grouping the way you are? How does it facilitate whatever it is you want them to learn in the activity that requires the group? And how often are your groups mixed abilities or random groups? Sometimes that's important because maybe your goal isn't necessarily growth in this specific skill. Maybe you want them to be working on social dynamics, or you want them to work on specific roles or leadership or something like that. Well, then mixed ability groups or random groups can work that way. When you are grouping, you want it to relate specifically to your instruction and the purpose of your instruction. And please do not use your high ability and gifted students as peer tutors or teacher's assistants or to lead the group all the time. They are not often in everybody else's zone of proximal development, which means they're not a model. And they're often not very good at explaining why they understand something. They get it. And they don't know why other people don't get it, which makes it hard to break down. And if they are spending time teaching other students, then they're not spending time learning themselves. And A lot of times I hear people say, oh, well, but they have to really know it really well to be able to explain it to somebody else. Mm, they're not always good at explaining it to someone else, and they already know it. So they should have the opportunity to learn something new, right? So I really caution you. And that's a major complaint from gifted and high ability learners, is having to be in groups where they are managing everybody else's learning or spending time teaching everybody else, when a lot of times they don't understand why the other kids don't understand. So flexible grouping allows students to learn and continue to grow, because you're putting kids together and facilitating how you can deliver that curriculum and those learning opportunities for them. Okay. And yes, it does go back to asynchronous development, because you're moving them at different times for where they are in their development. All right, item number 5, and I see we have questions. So after item number 5, we're going to get to those questions. Item number 5 is what you do with them when they're flexibly grouped. So they need targeted differentiation. So targeted differentiation is about figuring out where they are and then giving them something different so they can grow. So there's a study that Peters and some of his colleagues did in 2017, and they assessed students across a school, and they looked to see what did students already know at the beginning of the school year. And students know 20 to 49%. This is all of the kids in the school, right? Knew 20 to 49% of what was going to be taught in the current grade level in reading. So they came in knowing somewhere between a quarter and half of what was going to be taught in reading before instruction started. And in math, it was 14 to 37%. So a third. They knew a third of the math before the teacher ever started class. And so it's important to figure out who knows what so that you can provide opportunities to grow. The first way to do that is pre-assessing. That's figuring out what do they already know. So you can do that with open-ended questions. It doesn't have to be a multiple choice test that you write that takes a long time to put together. It can be a few questions at the end of whatever unit you're doing before you start the next unit. With little ones, it could be observations and conversations. It could be a KWL, what do you know, want to know, what did you learn, or a TWH, what do you think, what do you want to know, and how do you want to learn it, chart, a mind map, the end of unit test. If you're doing an end of unit assessment, use it at the beginning. There are lots of ways to pre-assess. And what works for you will depend on your content area and your students. Pick one, try it, and just try it in one area, right? You want to keep the pre-assessment because you want to document the data that you gathered and why you're making a change or you're not making a change, because you need that data to justify your next steps. Once you pre-assess, that's when the targeted differentiation comes in. You want to provide targeted alternatives because you want to facilitate continuous growth for the student. And you want to use it based on that pre-assessment data. You want to make sure you're appropriately challenging them. You want to give students something that's the right level for them, which is why it is directed, not free choice. You might have students who know you give them a pre-assessment and they're going to test out of the whole unit. So you need to give them an alternative activity to do. If it's just free choice, well, they could choose things they already know and not be challenged and not continue to grow. So you want to make sure that the choices you provide are at the appropriate level, which may mean that different students have different choices. You can also build on their interests, which teachers are doing all the time now. That tends to be part of choice boards. But again, it needs to be appropriate level of choice. And you need some accountability. There are expectations you will do the alternate activity and you'll be invested in it. So a couple of targeted differentiation techniques that you can use are providing independent study. So when a student tests out of something or doesn't need to be in the whole group, they can work on an independent study, which is something that's based on their interest, but at an appropriate level, and you do the appropriate level by the resources that they are provided or expected to use. With younger students, Susan Weinbrenner's approach, she calls it the 4 Cs. They collect information, they compare the information, they create a product, and then they communicate that. With older students, the I search process is the story of my examining this question that I have. It starts with a self-selected question. I have to have a research plan. I follow that plan. There's accountability and documentation along the way. I create a product demonstrating what I've learned, and then I share that. You'll notice I highlighted an interested audience. A lot of times we have our high ability students present to the class. That's not an interested audience. They may be interested in some topic that no one else in your class is interested in. Find somebody in the school who's interested in whatever their research project is and have them present to that small group of people who are also interested. Continuing to have high ability students present their independent studies to the whole class doesn't tend to help them build relationships, and it sometimes can ostracize them. Another approach is to reduce practice. This works really well in skill-based things. So in math, in map skills, in world languages, in vocabulary. Basically, you identify the most difficult problems and you reduce the practice to the most difficult problems. And if students can do almost all of them right, not perfectionism, so we're going to let them miss one, then they don't need all the other practice. Because research that Karen Rogers has done tends to show that high ability students do better in math and science when they're taught faster, and when they are drilled on things that they already know, they forget and mislearn things. So it's actually negative for them to continue to practice things they already know. And so giving them an alternate activity is, again, that kind of targeted approach to help them continue to grow. So we want to be sure that we are figuring out what they come to us already knowing, because so many students already have some baseline knowledge. So each unit, maybe it's even sometimes smaller in lessons. You do a pre-assessment, figure out what they know, and then you give them an alternate activity. And the first time you do this, you don't do it in everything. You pick an area you want to start in, and maybe it's just one lesson or one unit, and start there. So these are the 5 things. They're diverse, they're asynchronous, they tend to be intense. So flexible grouping and targeted differentiation can make a difference for them. So there are lots of opportunities for you to learn more coming up here in the Teacher Summit and with the online opportunities from NAGC. The part about being intense in the Teacher Summit, there's a talk about being vulnerable and their challenges. There's also a webinar coming up still this month about perfectionism, actually 2 webinars on perfectionism. And then in the Teacher Summit, there are several sessions about differentiation, and there's an online module for differentiation offered by NAGC. And so with that, I'm going to come over here and look at some of these questions. To what degree do expectations of gifted parents and gifted children affect perfectionism mindset? That's a very good question. And different researchers sort of tell you different things. I think sometimes gifted students blame their perfectionism on their parents when their parents didn't actually mean to set overly high expectations. Sometimes I just externalize my own expectations on my parents. But a lot of researchers would say that perfectionism is learned and reinforced. And so that accidental reinforcement, you get attention when you do things really well, and then you have more opportunities because you did that thing really well, which is kind of a self-fulfilling cycle and not so healthy. So it is important to help parents understand the difference between adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism. Having gifted students explain concepts they understand to their fellow classmates helps them sharpen their communication skills. Imagine that they are working on their communication skills pretty regularly in your classroom already, because every student in your room has opportunities to talk to other students. And I'm wondering how often the goal is that your students are improving their communication skills, because it will help them grow in communication on occasion. But if they're doing that a lot, then they're not growing in their content area. And it actually tends to backfire, because it causes them to be more critical of their peers, because they don't always understand, particularly elementary gifted kids, don't always understand why other students don't get it. I pulled a group of elementary students once, and we talked about what the research says about being gifted and things like that. And what students told me was, I just thought everybody else wasn't paying attention. And so we talked about, no, everybody else is paying attention. They just need to hear it more than you do. And that changed their whole perspective about things. So I think that can be tricky. All right. Do we have justification for the added expense for highly gifted students? Okay. The added expense for a lower pupil to teacher ratio when students are highly gifted. I would be happy to talk more about highly and profoundly and exceptionally gifted students offline and in a different setting. There are specialized programs for those, and the rationalization for that is that they are a mirror population to other high need special education populations that have low student to teacher ratios. So in many specialized program in special education, the ratio is more like 10-1, because the need of the students is so great compared to their same age peers. And that's true on both ends of the ability spectrum.
Lynette, we also had a question from Cynthia around research or advocacy regarding the impact of requiring advanced learners to endure dosages of reading remediation, even though they are, for example, reading on or above grade level. So I'm thinking, students who are already showing mastery but are having to repeat or have the same content as other students.
Yes, I think Karen Rogers' work is probably the piece that fits that best, and it's a little bit older research, but she's the researcher who pulled together effect sizes and information about students' growth and in different settings and what facilitates their growth the most. I think the biggest piece is that students who are forced to be in environments where they are not working at their appropriate level tend to learn mistakes or don't make growth while everybody else is making growth. And there was another piece. I'll think of it in a minute. And so you want them to have opportunities to grow, but Karen Rogers' work was particularly in math and science and world languages, where that repetition was actually negative to their future performance. And so we certainly don't want negative future performance. The other thing that kind of relates to that is that some of the research in underachievement suggests that underachievement can occur when students have educational experiences that are too difficult for 3 years or far too easy for 3 years. And if it's too easy, they don't know that they can do hard things, and then they don't have expectations for themselves, and they don't think they can do it, which leads them not to try doing things and to avoid challenge. And so underachievement can look different if they don't know that what they're capable of doing. And so repeatedly being in environments where you're under challenged and then you're suddenly in an appropriate environment can cause real issues and the underachievement. And then the last question I see here is about a change in students after COVID. And I I think we're all trying to figure out what it looks like post-COVID. With the students that I serve, we have been undertaking a lot of discussion and a lot of shift in how we support students because we have found our students are shying away from challenge. And the way they think challenge gets addressed is somebody else fixes it. So if the class is too hard and I don't know how to do the problem, the teacher makes it easier for me, or I just don't need to do that problem. And so I think because of how we all navigated a terrible challenge and we were all doing things the best way we could, we lessened the challenge for many students academically. And we changed our expectations because so many other things in life were hard. And so now our students, kind of like I was talking about with the underachievement, they don't know how to persevere through a challenge because they really haven't had to, at least an academic challenge. They may have other areas of their lives. So helping them understand how those skills to persevere through other challenges can be applied in academics can be helpful. But we are certainly seeing students with fewer both academic skills and academic prowess than we did before. And so, I mean, it's a small sample of students from across Kentucky who choose to come to a very different program, but I think that's probably indicative of what we're seeing with a lot of students in our schools. Um, and I thank you very much for staying in education and being committed to your students, because so many people are leaving our field and your students need you and you are making a difference for them. So thank you for your commitment to your students and being here.
Well, thank you, Lynette. I wanted to quickly share a little bit of information from NHEC with everybody. As Lynette mentioned, our Teacher Summit is coming up at the end of February. That's a great virtual event to get more information on your gifted students, teaching strategies, and more. And by attending today, you can save $40 on registration. You can use this code. The recording will be sent to everybody afterwards, so you can go back and check out this code and get that discount. And if you're not yet an NAGC member, we've got tons of member benefits, some of which Lynette mentioned, and I'll share a couple more here. We also have a code for attending today to get a discount on membership. And then finally, I just wanted to share some of our NHEZ tools. So if you're a teacher, we've got a lot of really great tools that are available to teachers. Many of these are free. Some are PD that you can purchase. Draw your attention to those upcoming webinars. Lynette mentioned 2 upcoming webinars on perfectionism. Those can be found at that nhec.org/webinars link. And then any of our previous webinars you can find at our YouTube channel. And those are available for you to watch and catch up anytime on anything that you've missed that we've presented. And then Teaching for High Potential and also Parenting for High Potential are 2 great publications that NHC puts out. As a member, you have access to those publications and to the archives. So if there's something that you're curious about or have questions about, you can go check them out in the archives. And if you're a parent, I encourage you to check out our free family tip sheets that are available in English and Spanish on a variety of topics related to parenting gifted ed. So again, these links will be included in that video that we'll send out to everybody after the event. And thank you again, Lynette. This has been great having you. Oh, I did see a question here in the chat about receiving a certificate. Yes, we'll be sending out a certificate to those who attended the event. So thank you all so much for being here, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again, Lynette.
Thank you.